Welcome to World War II Indiana Landmarks, Episode 20, the Atterbury Army Air Field and the Atterbury-Bakalar Air Museum. I'm your host, Ron May, author of the book, World War II Indiana Landmarks. For today's episode, we travel south down Interstate 65 to the northern part of the city of Columbus, Indiana. It is home to the former Atterbury Army Air Field and the location of the Atterbury-Bakalar Air Museum. The Atterbury Army Air Field was built on 2,000 acres of south-central Indiana farmland in mid-1942, just north of Columbus, Indiana. This is a view of Atterbury Army Air Field after it was completed. The initial mission for the airfield was for integrated air-ground combat training with Army Division forces training at nearby Camp Atterbury. The combined training, however, never materialized. Instead, the airfield endured 4 name changes and many different starts, stalls, stops, and changes to its intended mission during the first few years of its operation. It wasn't until March 1944 that Atterbury Army Airfield found a sustained mission of training glider pilots for the Troop Carrier Command. The following video clip provides a brief overview of the production of the gliders and what they could do.
The genius of the American automobile manufacturer Henry Ford turns to the mass production of gliders. Giant Army transport gliders made almost entirely of spruce and plywood. Wings are fitted as the finished ships move along an assembly line that never stops. Pilots to man the new silent fleets of invasion craft are constantly training. Each glider built to carry a striking force of men fully equipped for battle. The nose lifts up and a scout car complete with crew is taken aboard. Towed by a transport, the glider goes aloft. 3,000 pounds of motorless aircraft taking to the sky on its own wings. A ship nearly as large as a medium bomber. The pilot releases his line, cutting loose from the tow plane, and he's on his own. Down to earth for a perfect 3-point landing. Cargo and transport gliders proving their efficiency as new, swift, silent weapons of invasion.
Columbus area farmers sometimes got a close-up look at the gliders and the pilots who had taken off from the nearby airfield, as they occasionally made unintended landings in the farmers' fields and had to be picked up by base airfield personnel. Upon graduation from the program, the pilots received a glider pilot device, which they wore on their uniforms. The peak of glider pilot training at Atterbury Army Airfield came in March 1945, when 745 takeoffs and landings were recorded in one day. The glider used by the U.S. Army Air Forces was the Waco CG-4A. There were 13,900 of them built and delivered, manufactured at a cost of about $15,000 each. The gliders were made of wood, fabric, and some steel. Each glider measured 48 feet in length, stood 12.7 feet in height, and had a wingspan of just over 48 feet. The gliders were packed and shipped from the manufacturing sites to the airfields and then reassembled there. Each of the gliders had room in their cargo holds for several different types of loads, including 13 soldiers, a jeep and 4 soldiers, a 105mm howitzer and 3 soldiers, an ammunition trailer, 6 wounded on stretchers and 1 medic, a small bulldozer, or even 3 mules. When fully loaded, they weighed 7,500 pounds. This is what it looked like when the glider was carrying 13 soldiers. The gliders were flown by 2 pilots and towed by C-47 cargo planes via a 350-foot tow rope. The cargo plane would fly over the glider with a hook to snag the tow line and then pull the glider upward. In this photo, the glider is beginning its liftoff from the tarmac, pulled forward from the tow rope attached to the C-47 ahead of it. When the gliders neared their destination, the pilot released the tow rope and the gliders began their fast descent to the ground. Pilots of the gliders could steer and turn, but they could not stop their steady descent. They did their best to control the landing of their aircraft. Many landed safely in fields, but doing so without engines and in fields fraught with natural and enemy-placed obstacles, it often meant that the gliders broke apart on landing. Sadly, this resulted in the loss of life for some of the glider crew, as well as significant damage to equipment. In spite of the risk of catastrophic crashes, many of the gliders made relatively safe landings and successfully delivered their forces or equipment to their objectives. During training missions, the gliders were reused many times. However, after a combat mission, only about 5% of the gliders could be repaired and reused. Bloomington, Indiana native William Bruce Dalton was one of those glider pilots serving in Europe. He was born in 1914 and graduated from Bloomington High School. In 1942, at the age of 27, he enlisted in the Army Reserve and began the flight glider pilot program in Bloomington. Assigned to the 43rd Troop Carrier Squadron, 315th Troop Carrier Group, he arrived in England in the summer of 1944 to prepare for combat flight operations. Dalton finally got his chance to fly a combat mission into Holland in September 1944 for Operation Market Garden, the largest airborne assault of World War II. "I took a jeep trailer and 8 medics," recalled Dalton in his interview. His squadron landed in a field along with other gliders while coming under gunfire from nearby German infantry. The massive operation was designed for Allied paratroopers to secure key bridges in Holland and quickly penetrate Germany from the north. The operation ultimately failed, and the war dragged on for another 8 months. Dalton survived the war and returned to his wife and son in mid-1945. They made their home in Columbus, Indiana, where Dalton eventually owned and operated 2 men's clothing stores. Glider units played key roles in delivering troops and equipment behind enemy lines in Europe, beginning with the invasion of Sicily in July 1943, and continuing through the rest of the war. Throughout the war, the U.S. military used 4,003 gliders in 8 different air assault missions. While that number included the almost 517 gliders used for the Normandy invasion, an even greater number of gliders were used for Operation Market Garden in Holland, 1,900 of them, and Operation Varsity in the Rhine River region of Germany, 906 gliders. The video clip that follows shows some gliders landing and a few crashing during Operation Market Garden in Holland. Note the efforts to free a pilot who was stuck in the carnage of the glider nose following its landing and damage. At the end of the war, a total of 216 glider pilots had died during combat glider operations. The training of glider pilots was not the last or arguably even the most important mission at Atterbury Army Air Field. In August 1944, 2 months after the D-Day landings in Normandy, the airfield began receiving C-47 air transports of injured service members who were flown in from the European theater after a stop at Mitchell Field in New York. From New York, it was a 4.5-hour flight to Indiana. The proximity of the Army's Wakeman General Hospital at Camp Atterbury, only 12 miles away, made the Atterbury Army Air Field an obvious choice as a landing and transfer site for the wounded. Most of the casualties came from England, but some were also flown in from France. After touching down at Atterbury Army Air Field, the patients were transported by ambulance to Wakeman General Hospital at Camp Atterbury, arriving within 1 hour of landing. The receiving and transporting of the wounded from Atterbury Army Airfield to Wakeman General Hospital continued throughout the final 12 months of the war. At the end of the war, Atterbury Army Airfield became inactive, but remained on standby status. Reactivated in 1949, it was used during the Korean War and continued to operate in a reserve status through the Vietnam War. In 1954, the name of the base was changed to Bakalar Air Force Base to honor World War II pilot John Edmund Bakalar, a Hammond, Indiana native who was killed in action over France on September 1, 1944. In 1970, all military operations at Bakalar Air Force Base were shut down, and in 1971, the Columbus Regional Airport took over the airfield. Just over 20 years later, in 1992, the Atterbury-Bakalar Air Museum was built on part of the former airfield to preserve its memory. The museum dedicated an expansion to the museum in 2014. Bruce Dalton, the former glider pilot from Bloomington, never trained at the Atterbury Army Airfield, but he became one of the most active volunteers at the museum for 2 decades. He pursued a relentless goal of finding and securing an authentic glider nose cockpit to display at the museum. Inside the museum, you will find the nose of a Waco CG-4A glider that Dalton secured as a signature display for the museum. Here is a view from the inside of the glider nose. An exhibit tells the story of glider training and missions at Atterbury Army Airfield. Other exhibits tell the history of the airfield and showcase some of the units and people who trained at the former Army Airfield and later Atterbury-Bakalar Air Force Base. There is a cutaway of a typical barracks in the 1940s, an art exhibit of aircraft, a scale aircraft models display, and a rotating beacon from the original airfield, as well as a display on the Tuskegee Airmen. Visitors will also find an Indiana Aviation Hall of Fame wall that displays the photographs and service summaries of Hoosier pilots who served in the Army and Air Force, including 4 women. Jean Llewellyn Norbeck is one of the pilots featured on the Indiana Aviation Wall of Fame in the museum. While Jean didn't have any direct connection to Atterbury Army Airfield, she did have a lot to do with the city of Columbus and military flying. A Columbus, Indiana native, she was born on November 14, 1912, and graduated from Columbus High School in 1929. She earned her civilian pilot's license while she was attending the State College of Washington, where she graduated in 1933. In 1940, she married Edward Norbeck. The Norbecks were living in Honolulu on December 7, 1941, and after the attack, they volunteered to become air wardens. When Edward later joined the Army in 1943, Jean, wanting to do her part, joined the Women Air Force Service Pilots, WASPs, that same year. After completing her training, she was assigned as a test pilot at Camp Shaw in South Carolina. She and other WASPs flew training planes that had been redlined due to mechanical problems. On October 16, 1944, she was assigned to test fly a Vultee BT-13 primary trainer that had been reported as having a stuck wing. During her flight, the left wing failed, and she crashed while attempting to land. Norbeck was killed instantly. Her body was transported back to her hometown in Columbus, where she received a burial that included a flag and military escort, an unusual honor because the WASPs were listed as civil service employees and not official members of the military. She was 32 years old at the time of her death. She and Edward had no children. The local hero's service was later memorialized with the naming of the chapel at the former Atterbury Army Airfield. Less than 2 blocks from the museum is a former barracks building from Atterbury Army Air Base that was later converted into a chapel during the Korean War. It is the only building that remains from the former World War II airfield. Restored from 1995 to 1998, the chapel was renamed the Jean Llewellyn Norbeck Memorial Chapel in May 1998. Both the museum and the chapel help keep alive the memory of those who served in the Army Air Forces at Atterbury Army Airfield during World War II. Learn more about the Atterbury Army Airfield, the Atterbury-Bakalar Museum, and those who served in my new book, World War II Indiana Landmarks, available for purchase on my website or wherever books are sold. And while on my website, check out my trilogy of Indiana World War II service stories. Thanks for tuning in to this episode.